Welcome to our West Family Tactics video, Tactics 101.
I am Mini Mr. West, and this is my daddy, Mr. West.
Mr. West and little Mr. West, Mini Mr. West. We're looking at pawn forks in our video because pawn forks are very overlooked and often not spotted by players. So what we decided is to make a video to show what they look like and how to spot them and how to stop them when you do spot them, and then to see a few examples of real games. So let's start with the basic setup here. Jack, is there a tactic here?
There is a pawn fork E4.
Okay, good. So pawns on their homes go 1 or 2. This pawn's going to go 2. When he gets to E4, he's going to attack 2 big pieces at the same time. Generally speaking, it's easy to fork rooks and knights. Do you know why?
Because they're not diagonal pieces?
That's correct. That's exactly correct. They can't attack back. A rook cannot capture diagonally. A knight cannot capture diagonally. And therefore, they're easy to attack with pawns because pawns can capture diagonally. So when your opponent moves the piece they want to save away, usually the more expensive one, we get to take the other one free. Very nice. Okay, let's look at our second example here. What do you do if you have to attack pieces that can move on diagonals? Generally speaking, what do you have to do a little differently in a case like this? Jack?
You have to have a pawn guarding.
Good. You've got to have a support pawn that helps the head pawn go forward and make the pawn fork happen. So if this guy on F3 wasn't there, then the queen or the bishop could just swoop down and take. So after E4, in this case, black will lose a piece to the tactic because even after bishop takes, pawn takes, I'm not really sure this queen is even going to want to go here because she'd be walking into she'd be walking into another tactic. What's that tactic called?
A pin.
A pin. Very good. Okay, so to review, pawn fork is good to attack all pieces, but if you're attacking pieces with diagonal moving power, like kings, queens, and bishops, you need to do a little preparation.
And one thing, you cannot pawn fork a pawn.
You actually can in some weird ways, but that requires certain circumstances. Okay, let's talk about how to get out of pawn fork. So sometimes there are ways to save your pieces when they get forked. So first of all, Jack, where's the pawn fork that black is going to make in this position?
The pawn fork is on E5.
Good. So E7 is going to move 2 squares off its home base and land on E5. By the way, I've been showing you examples with 2 square jumps. Pawns that go 1 step can also do pawn forks, obviously. So now the question becomes, is there some way to stop from losing a piece here for white? Is there a way to do it? Well, one way is to take advantage of the weakness that the pawn itself presents, which is being on the same file as the king. So if we move our queen or the rook onto the E file some way, we create what?
A pin.
We create a pin. And so a pawn that's pinned cannot attack or take or guard or do any of the things it usually does on diagonals. So in this case, after our opponent maybe breaks the pin, then we're able to save our other piece from the pin as well. So there are ways to get out of the pin sometimes using the weakness of the pawn against itself. Okay. Another way to stop a pawn fork from happening to you or attacking your pieces is to use forcing moves in return. So, for example, where's the pawn fork here, Jack? Black to move?
D5, which isn't really a pawn fork. You'll see why.
Good. So if the pawn attacks on D5, how does white get out of this? What's the way that white can get out of this?
Queen H5, 4.
Good. Very good. Queen H4 is a forcing move. It attacks the enemy king and checks. And as we all know, if your king's in check, you can't go off capturing pieces far away. You have to stop and deal with the check. And in this case, the king has to be careful where he goes because obviously the C file is closed off to him. The E file squares could lead to more attackers coming in. So if he goes to D7, now we can actually continue to check and force queens off the board. What move will we play next?
Queen G4.
Good. We play Queen G4 here. And that would put the black queen on the button to act.
Another move you can play in that position was Queen H7.
You can, although what's the matter with that move?
Oh yeah, they just take your queen.
Yeah, correct. So after queen g4, queen takes, rook takes, we managed to save both of our pieces from the pin, or from the pawn fork, by using forcing moves in
Who did
return.
that?
Okay. Now, there are some instances of pawn forks occurring early in chess games. I think probably the most famous one that kids are used to seeing is the so-called center fork trick. And the idea here is that there is no pawn fork on the board as yet, but if we capture e5, we draw the black knight to that square, and then we use a pawn fork to make our tactic happen. So after captures, where's the pawn fork, Jack?
Pawn d4.
Very good. Pawn goes to d4.
Which I just have to say something. It isn't really a pawn fork because the bishop just takes.
Well, yeah, I mean, I think we kind of agree on this a little bit. The center fork trick is, I think, is slightly overrated because you give a piece away to make the tactic work, and so you give a piece away and then you get a piece back, and pretty much no matter how your opponent responds, material will be even at the end. You might have some small edge in development or center control or some desirable element, but you won't have more material for sure. But there you go. It's a pawn fork that occurs very often in the opening. The next example is sort of one that comes out of the opening as well, but involves what I call a slow motion pawn fork. The slow motion pawn fork is where one pawn attacks two pieces on one on each successive move. So in the Ruy Lopez, we have this kind of a trap known as the Noah's Ark. And if white plays d4 here, white plays d4 in this position, and we get into a situation where it looks like perhaps white's threatening to play. Don't do that. White's threatening to play d5 and attack our pin, but in fact, black can turn the tables here by shooing away the bishop and then pouncing on the pawn. And it turns out to be quite dangerous here to take back on d4 and initiate trades, because if our queen makes it into the center, now we have, in fact, two pieces that can be attacked by pawns. Jack, do you see the move that attacks both of these pieces? Starts off by attacking one and then attacks the other. Pawn.
c5.
Very good. So what we're going to do is we're actually going to play a pawn fork with two pawn moves in a row. So it's kind of a pawn fork that happens in slow motion over two moves. And in fact, it's actually going to be over three moves, because after we play c5, our opponent's queen is going to go to d5 and set up a counter threat. And we have to stop that counter threat first. Do you know the move that stops both of white's threats here of checkmate and, checkmate and winning a rook? What one move can stop both of those threats for black?
Ooh, a very good move. Attacks the queen, and the queen guards the rook. Bishop e6.
Well done. So black has to stop their tactic long enough to neutralize these threats. And then once the queen moves out of the way, then we continue our pawn fork with c4. And we clean up there with the extra piece. I don't know why. Maybe someone out there in chess land knows why this is called the Noah's Ark trap. I don't know why it's called the Noah's Ark trap, but
I think I
it
know
is.
why. Maybe it's because it's a pawn chain that traps a piece.
Okay, but I'm not sure what that would have to do with Noah's Ark. Anyway, it doesn't really matter. So here's an example of a pawn fork that happened in one of Jack's early games when he first started playing online, and his opponent played e6 and e5 on successive moves, kind of wasted a tempo in the opening, and Jack pounced on the center pawn. His opponent attacked his knight. When he moved the knight back, he created an excellent square for a tactic. And this happens sometimes in the opening when you're not, you're trying to develop your pieces, you're trying to get them to do stuff, and sometimes you end up putting a piece on a square where it seems natural, but it in fact isn't the best place. So during the opening, you really do have to keep your eyes on available center squares. Do you see the tactic? Do you remember this?
The tactic is e5.
Very nice.
On
e5.
e5, it attacks the bishop and the knight. Then they pin the pawn, and then you unpin.
Yeah, how do you unpin?
By moving your queen e2.
Very good. So yeah, black tries to use our stopping fork trick, the pin method of stopping forks. But But if we just reinstate our queen presence on the e file there, we end up putting the pawn fork back into play, and black in fact will lose a piece.
And we
here.
also threaten a queen trade if we move their pawn, then the queen takes e2. That would threaten queen trade.
Is it good to trade pieces and trade queens when you're up a piece?
No. I mean, yes.
Yes. Oh, okay, good. Here's a game from Jack's career, later in his career, and he's playing a very tough chess character from PS139 named Caitlin. And Jack and Caitlin had quite an interesting game going. But in this position, Jack played Queen E4, aiming for a checkmating square. But he, in fact, walked into a pawn fork in this case, and Caitlin found a very good defensive move to not only neutralize the checkmate threat, but in fact turn the tables. What was the tactic she played?
F3.
Good, very good. So after F3, in fact, now Jack is going to lose a piece rather than make a checkmate out. And this happens sometimes. You have a plan. If you don't check the plan thoroughly enough, you can get yourself in trouble. And in fact, rook takes G2 is probably the best shot here for black, because they're going to lose a piece as it is. And it's going to be a rook because Jack will not let his queen be taken. And Caitlin went on to win that game. Up a rook is a lot. It's a lot of material. And if you're a strong player, you can make it work. And we'll finish up with two examples from Grandmaster play. So we saw the move rook e6 just being played by black. This is a very nice tactic by Ben Larson, Grandmaster Ben Larson, against Jonathan Penrose from, I don't remember when this game was. It was quite a while back. But sometimes you don't have a pawn fork on the board, but you can actually create a pawn fork if you see pieces that you want to push around into positions that would be helpful. Do you remember the move here?
The move here.
Yeah. We need to get this king to walk here so our f pawn can get involved. How do we get him there?
Bishop G6.
Yeah, that's right. Larson played bishop G6 in this position. The idea being that if king takes F5, wins an exchange. And actually, it wins, quite a bit, because this piece is, effectively tangled for the moment, and white has a pawn on the E6 that might survive for a while. And so, actually, Penrose did not obviously walk into the tactic, being a very strong player himself. He played king F8. But the reason that tactic works so well is because even if Penrose doesn't fall for it, we end up in a situation here where white is just simply in control of the position. Black's pieces are completely tied down to the defense of E8. And now white can just slowly improve the game until a piece trade is effective enough for the white king to infiltrate. So, in fact, Penrose resigned in this position here. Now, our last example comes from Etienne Bacrot against a player named Meisner. I don't know who Meisner is, but Bacrot is one of France's best grandmasters. And in this situation, once again, there is no pawn fork on the board at the moment. But if we notice, black just played the move rook d7, putting the rook on a square where a pawn fork looks suggestive. But obviously, if we have enemy pawns facing off with us, sometimes it's better to put another piece on that square. Do you remember the move?
The move was knight takes.
The move was knight takes. And the idea here is that after knight takes, we do what?
C6.
We play C6. And not only do we get our piece back, as it were, the more important thing is that we clear the way of black's remaining pawn. We turn white's B and C pawns both into passers instantaneously. And we produce what is likely to be an extra piece in the form of a queen pretty soon. And notice also that if rook takes, we take with the bishop. And then if knight takes back, obviously, again, we've created some fairly dangerous pass pawns.
Well, they're not only pass pawns, they're also strong pawns.
Yeah, it's just clearing, everything's clearing. The lines for the rooks are clearing. and the lines for the ponds are clearing.
And
So
I'm sure a lot of us know Fun Master Mike. He in one of his videos he says that 2 ponds are very strong, and you usually need them in like a middle game if you want to get a pass pond. You need to have 2 ponds walking together.
Yeah, they definitely get a lot stronger when they're together in numbers. Okay, and that's it for our video on pond forks. Good luck. Keep your eyes open for pond forks, and don't forget, if you get caught by one, double check, because there might be a way out of it. You might be able to save yourself. Thanks for watching, and it's been fun doing our first video. High five, bud. All right. Bye, everybody. Say bye.
Bye-bye, everybody.
Good job.